Matthew, my friend, good to see you again, as always. Whenever you and I get a chance to sit and talk, the world seems to get crazier, more unpredictable, more risky, never more stable, never more predictable. So let's talk about the world. Let's talk about the world here. We're a week away from the US election. It's been and gone. It's surprised a lot of people. It's terrified a lot of people. It's comforted a lot of people. It's comforted more people than it has in America, it would seem. So, in the wake of Trump's victory, how do you think that changes the world on a bigger, more geopolitical level? And how do you think that changes the financial world?
A lot of important questions there, Brandon. To your point, every time we get together, things just seem to be more and more unpredictable and more crazy, and yet some things are sadly consistent. The things that aren't being discussed are sadly consistent. The things that are very academic and dry, like debt and campaign promises and political grandstanding and a lot of wonderful platitudes and ignoring certain obvious elephants in the room. But to your point on what's happening right now in the world, and certainly with this very polarizing election, which even if this comes out in 3 years, people will remember this time was a very polarizing time. It's hard to discuss certain topics at all, and certainly when you get into politics. And yet, Mearsheimer at University of Chicago, brilliant, academic, described it as, left or right, and this could be Democrat or Republican in the U.S. or Tories in the left and Labor in the U.K. or pick your country. It could be in France or Germany too, with all these coalitions. It's amazing. He says it's kind of Tweedledee and Tweedledum on both sides. And then we're in Switzerland, so I can afford to be Swiss neutral right now and not take a particular stance and maybe cover myself. But, and even Druckenmiller, when it comes to the markets or the economy, regardless of who wins or who just won, is going to be largesse in fiscal spending. And regardless of who wins, when they're campaigning, they're going to promise things that we're going to require more fiscal spending, more deficit spending. Because when you look at the elections, of course, in the U.S., when you look at the grandstanding there, or when you see it in Europe too, or anywhere, except for perhaps Argentina, where they can afford to be more blunt because things are so bad. But almost never did anyone discuss debt, the currency, what that's done to the middle class, what boring things like central bank policy or fiscal deficits mean to currencies, and what that means to inflation, however it's reported or misreported, and what that does to the man on the street when they're being promised all kinds of solutions. And the markets are seemingly immortal. I suppose they can be if you consistently butter them up or buffer them up with synthetic liquidity of some form. You can technically have deficits without tears and politicians without dishonesty, but you'll have to do that at the expense of something. And when it comes to this choice between your national IOU and your bond market or your currency, history confirms they'll destroy the currency to save their IOUs or their bond markets. And so all of this polarization, all this left versus right, debate, all of this emotion about what we're promising or what politicians are promising is ignoring what's actually happening. 35% raise in bankruptcies this year, year over year, 13-year peaks, small businesses failing under Powell's higher for longer, auto sales, manufacturing, employment flat to negative for the year, people debating like pundits with headless chickens about whether we're in a recession, whether you're looking at SOM or whether you're looking at the conference board leading indicators and bankrupt. Why are we even debating this? And so I think it is fascinating, this disconnect between platitudes and math, a fundamental understanding of history and the voice of the people. And the people are good, but they're naive if they think a politician, left or right, is going to save them at this point. Someone said, I thought it was very funny, what good is it whoever wins this election? It's like being nominated the captain of the Titanic after the iceberg's been hit. And yet we can keep churning on debating whether it's red or white wine on the A deck, but the real issue is the iceberg. And no one's talking about the iceberg or how few lifeboats we have left. And that isn't anymore the sensationalism of a gold bug. It should be the common sense of political honesty. But good luck getting elected talking austerity or talking sound fiscal policies. So you can understand it. What's sad to me is most people are good people. They are honest people. They believe what they're being told because they couldn't imagine telling such overt, dishonest things without accountability. So they are wanting to believe the sweet little lies, left, right, or center. That's my view.
Well, you touched on there about academics, and I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought to. This academicization of economics. It's become. It used to be something where some extraordinary real-world thinkers would sit and ponder and write incredible books about real world economics and how things like inflation and currency production affect not just economics, not just markets, but people's lives.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that, because I know it's, as I say, it's something you think about a lot.
Yeah, I was thinking back when Ronnie Sturfla years ago introduced me to Russell Napier, and that was just a fantastic conversation. Nothing to be gained other than just the knowledge, right? The discussion, and from those conversations, I started thinking of the classic kind of economists going back to the 18th century with David Hume, and then of course you can think about von Mises and Reinhardt and Rogoff, these others. But I was also thinking about something as simple as Lord Mervyn King in the UK, who's is a brilliant economist, and I've been listening more and reading more of Thomas Koenig, who was the president of the Kansas City Fed, kind of a rebel maverick in the FOMC. But what I got from Lord King and from Thomas Koenig was something interesting about this notion of we've lost the ability to be practical, we're trying to be academic, as if economics is a science. There's a hubris in that. And we've just learned from Fauci and COVID hysteria that there's no science to that, to viruses necessarily, or vaccines. There's no science to climate change. There's no science to derivatives. In the sense, there's a lack of humility that there is no kind of pragmatic science. We get to a point, like Hayek said, where the complexity of the debt, the complexity of the markets, the complexity of the instruments is beyond a science, an optimization. And so this idea that academics can always optimize. We can optimize the Fed's balance sheet. We can optimize the CPI or the PCE. We can optimize U6 or U3 employment by doing this with these interest rates. We can optimize these models, which are way beyond the complexity of the reality we're in. And what I was thinking about academic, whether they're sell-siders on Wall Street or certainly Fed politicians, because everyone at the central bank is effectively a politician, and certainly anyone running for office, all they will do is optimize. Whether it's your private wealth manager at Goldman Sachs, whether it's whoever's running today for office, left, right, or center, or certainly who's ever at the FOMC who isn't, Thomas Koenig, a little bit of a renegade, they're going to optimize. They're going to promise you optimization. And I was comparing that type of, I think, dishonest science of economics to my grandfather's era and mentors I knew who were at West Point in the 40s, just before the war. And the first course you learned was what happens when things go to hell? What happens when you're not optimized, when you have to retreat? The key to a good strategy is knowing how to pull off a great retreat. And the case studies they would use would be Robert E. Lee, after he lost Gettysburg, pulled off a brilliant retreat. That was something to study. Or George McClellan, who was on the gates of Richmond, had to retreat all the way across the peninsula. Of course, then there's Napoleon coming back, what the Wehrmacht couldn't do after Stalingrad. So retreat was something you took seriously because it recognized the idea that you could be wrong, or that you could go over your skis, and you'd have to be accountable for that and quickly opine for it. What I see in the markets, whether it's at the Fed, whether it's in the bond markets, whether it's at an S&P that seems to never die, or optimized and measured against things that, like, what I still think mean reversion matters from Bob Farrell. I still think the madness of crowds from Charlie McCabe matters. I still think Ben Graham's value matters. What's amazing about these current markets and systems is they're so optimized. No one wants to talk about that they could be wrong and what the retreat options are. No one. Of course, when you're running for office, you can't. But no one's even thinking about it. And again, you see that type of arrogance, that type of hysteria, that type of calm indifference to, oh, what if we're wrong, playing itself out right now in just a market that makes no sense. And we can talk about mean reversion, but look, it wasn't that long ago. It was just 2 years ago when we had, in the US, we had the worst nominal returns in stocks and bonds since the Civil War, just after the Civil War. But people forgot about that. Just 2023, we had 3 of the 4 largest bank crises in our country. No one's talking about that anymore. S&P's ripping, Nvidia's ripping, tech's gonna save us, et cetera. There's no real discussion of these signs that our army's losing, that we're bleeding out, that our ammunition train is weak, that our mules are getting tired, that we're running out of cannonballs. No, everything's gonna be fine. It's just keep optimizing with words, keep optimizing with, I think, somewhat twisted math when it comes to inflation or unemployment. Keep optimizing with PE ratios to the moon, and Nvidia's gonna save us, etc. Those type of things, to me, aren't being pragmatic at all. They're being dishonest. And yet, the investor du jour wants to believe those sweet little lies too when it comes to markets. And I'm not trying to be negative for negative's sake. I'm a belief in speculation. I'm a belief in other things besides just wealth preservation through gold. But a top is a top. And crazy is crazy. And yet to be talked about as a Chicken Little and to be critiqued for that, I don't think Bob Farrell's a Chicken Little or Charlie McKay or Ben Graham or Russell Napier or Lord Mervyn King or Thomas Hernig. I don't think they're Chicken Littles. They're just being practical.
Well, this idea of retreat, you get to a point in a lot of battles where you're fighting and your retreat gets cut off. There is no retreat. You reach this point where there's no way back, and you have to try and fight your way through. And it feels like that's where we are now, because the idea of retreat at this point, if we're going to keep this military analogy going, a retreat from here is severe austerity. It's recession. It's high unemployment. It's high interest rates to kill inflation. It's all the things that offer any kind of retreat are completely unpalatable to both the generals, but also the soldiers in working men and women in their jobs are not going to stand that retreat. So when you reach that point and the only retreat is, severe pain, what do they do? Because to push on forward, which is what they're going to have to do, what does that mean?
It's interesting, a great question too, because when using this analogy, and again, I'll go back to the West Point class with George McClellan, who nobody will remember, but he had to retreat when he tried to attack Richmond early in the Civil War. But rather than call it a retreat, he wired or telegraphed Abraham Lincoln and said it's a change of base.
Right.
He'd just been severely beaten at a place called Gaines' Mill in the 7 Days Battle. And he says it's a change of base, where everyone from the private to the generals to the major generals to the colonels to the lieutenants knew it was a retreat. So the first thing is, can you even admit you're in a retreat? And to your second point, most politicians and Fed officials and sell-siders at Bank X, Y, or Z, or private wealth managers with portfolio A, B, or C rarely want to admit a retreat or a recession until the NBER tells you, which is always way too late. And so to your point, you'll see the symptoms of a retreat, even though they may call it a change of base. You'll see it in the actual U6. You'll see it in the recession indicators that we still won't call a recession. You'll see it in the unemployment numbers. You'll see it in the layoffs. You'll see it in the freight index data on trains. And you'll see it in the oil markets. You'll see it in the dollar markets and the bond markets. You'll see signs of it everywhere. And to take this military analogy one step further, you don't have to study anything about military history or have ever gone to a West Point seminar. If you see a picket line coming and then a cavalry column coming towards your border with somebody else's flag, and then you see masses of infantry supported by masses of artillery with another flag, you don't need to be in the military to know that there's something coming to your border. Right. There are big changes coming. And to me, to take that analogy one step further, when you see 45 countries settling outside of the US dollar, when you see Saudi Arabia and the PBOC, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, the People's Bank of China, stacking gold at record levels, when you see the BRICS membership rising, when you see Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining the BRICS and having discussions about trade settlements and oil outside of the petrodollar, when you see Russia selling oil to China in yuan, which they then convert to buy products in China that were once made in America, and then net settling the spread in physical gold, which then goes on the Shanghai Exchange. In other words, when you see all these changes post-2022, when we weaponized the US dollar against a major power, a nuclear power, which was economically flirting with, if not already in bed with Russia and China, in bed with China, well, what myopic plan of attack was that? That had massive ramifications. You saw it right away. I have to admit, me and others did as well, but I totally agree that this was a turning point as big as the fall of 1971, when we weaponized the world reserve currency. Robert Triffin, George Maynard Keynes, even Obama warned against that in 2015. But don't go there against a major power. So in other words, you're seeing this army moving away from the US dollar. Because America is now in retreat, the US dollar is in retreat, the US Treasury is less loved. It's been net sold since 2014. Well, incidentally, central banks, these have been net stacking physical gold. These aren't gold bug arguments. These aren't even just military analogies. What are the troops on the ground doing? What is the movement suggesting to you? And the de-dollarization theme isn't some gold bug theme du jour to create hysteria. It isn't even the end of the US dollar. It's a repricing, it's a change of trust. These are hard to quantify. But, the fist pumps versus the handshakes, the movements by the Saudis, the movements by the UAE, the political relationships changing right now, what's happening with the petrodollar, what's happening with the BRICS, you can't ignore this anymore. These are clear troop movements. These are clear signs of, I think, a retreat away from the US dollar, but a movement towards something else. And most importantly, again, not making the headlines or the battle reports, the BIS just made last year physical gold a tier 1 asset alongside what? The US 10-year?
Yeah.
So that should be a pretty important headline. That should be understood by the guy on the street or the private in the regiment, right? But no one even knows about it or understands the implications of that. And what the implication to me is that the world is not catching on with what the BIS is telling us. And I'm not a big fan of the BIS, but let's call a duck a duck. They're saying, look, this IOU from Uncle Sam isn't as trusted anymore. It's not a tactical or strategic reserve asset for savings. It certainly isn't as trusted anymore. By the way, physical gold is. And that's no coincidence. That statement, that declaration was made at the same time that central banks continue to buy record levels of physical gold. Why? Because they like the color and the shine and the touch of gold? No, it's not because gold's in a bull market. No, it's because fiat money in general and the US dollar is in a bear market. And it's in a bear market because we've debased its value. And we've debased its value, why? To monetize our debt. And why is our debt so high? Because politicians have been promising things they can't afford and paying the delta in money literally mouse-licked at a central bank. So these are all ripple effects of really stupid, short-sighted plans. We are clearly in retreat, but we're calling it a change of base. And the rest of the world, led by the BRICS, is taking their flags away from our dollar towards something a little more golden. And we can't underestimate the implications of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I want to come back to the BRICS in a minute, but let's stick on the post-Trump world, because what you've just said, I think, is absolutely true in terms of what they need to do. What are Trump's options at this point? Because we all know what he said he's going to do. He's going to fix inflation.
Right.
Okay. I'd be curious as to how you think he might try and do that. He's going to create jobs. All the things that he's promised to do, we know he can't have all of them. He's going to be lucky to get some of them. So what do you think his options are? What do you think he tries to do first? And what chances of success do you give him?
Yeah, again, this goes back to my point. It's hard to be made captain of the Titanic when you've already hit the iceberg. And whether Trump or Harris have been elected, they're both going to face inflation. I don't think they're going to solve it in 4 years. We could talk about Harris's plans. It doesn't matter. It's moot because now we've got Trump and his understanding about kind of coming back to making America primary, making America great again, focusing on reshoring jobs, repatriating certain things that need to come back from the east to the west, certainly tariffs. All these things are incredibly inflationary.
Yeah.
And yet he wants to beat inflation. It may be a campaign promise. It may be a fundamental misunderstanding of what inflation is, which is, I suppose, debatable. But for me, it's the purchasing power of your currency at the end of the day. What can you do with it? It's not just a CPI measurement concocted at the Bureau of Labor Statistics in DC, but it's not just supply side shocks. It's really usually fiscal largesse.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to promise these things and certainly make a promise like I'm going to fix inflation, well, in the past we could fix inflation pretty quickly by jacking up interest rates on a Volcker-like miracle solution. But when you're at 35 to 36 trillion in debt, you don't have the Volcker option anymore.
No.
Powell could barely get to where he got before 2% real rates just crushed us, crushed the markets, crushed the middle class. His war against inflation, the white flag went up. We lost. There was a clear declaration we couldn't beat inflation.
Yeah.
And that was what just trying to get the Fed funds rate to just below 6%. When Volcker got it to 18-20, he had a lot more to play with because our national debt was significantly less. It was less than $1 trillion. Now we're at nearly 36 trillion. So what can he really do to fight inflation? He can kill demand by crushing the middle class even more. That will probably not win a lot of hearts and minds. He can reshore more jobs, but that's going to be expensive. I guess he could try something amazing. He could try to shrink government. And there's no doubt that part of his plan and part of having Elon Musk, who just fired 80% of X and Twitter, on his quote-unquote team, there's no doubt he's always campaigned about cleaning the swamp. But again, that's more expensive than just a bunch of pink slips to a big fat bureaucracy in DC.
Sure.
So the short answer, after the long answer to your question, in short, is I don't think Papa Smurf can do it. I don't think Santa Claus can do it. And I don't think Donald Trump can do it. That doesn't mean I'm mocking Trump supporters. I'm just saying the math doesn't seem to work. If you can cut entitlements and military spending by at least 40%, well, then I'm impressed.
Yeah.
And then we are talking about maybe cutting spending so we can tighten our belt in that type of austerity. Politically, if you can get away with it, that would certainly help. But again, I don't know if that can be done in 4 years. If you're cutting spending in the military and you're cutting spending in entitlements, you're going to also have to cut a lot of jobs.
Well, that's the flip side, right?
And that's going to cost money in a different way.
Yeah.
And so again, it's that point where you can no longer optimize anymore. You can no longer just move numbers around on a screen. And that's where I think economics as a science hasn't become practical. And I don't think those running for office and those sitting in their cabinets have a practical understanding of what debt has done to this country, where you run out of options. Again, going back to David Hume, a practical economist, 1750s, once your debt to GDP crosses the Rubicon of 100+%, growth dies by 1/3 mathematically. Now, we could argue optimizing different models, whether it's 1/3 or 1/5 or 1/6, but it's very hard to swim with a cannonball tied to your ankle. When you have this much debt, the Fed has very few options, the White House has very few options, certainly our House and Senate have very few options, and about 90% of those people, including the hundreds of PhDs at the FOMC who didn't get inflation right, who missed it, then you add in our Senate and our White House and our cabinet, most of them are mental midgets when it comes to practical economics, let alone academic economics. They're trained in making promises they can't deliver.
Well, look, you talk about the lack of options available to policymakers and central bankers. Unfortunately, the people who have the fewest options are us. The man in the street has the fewest number of options because his options are dictated by those who have very few options above them. And as the options get dictated, they get fewer and sparser. But one of the options that the man in the street has is to own gold, is to say, I want to opt out of a lot of this stuff. I want to protect myself against the big threat to me, which at this point, no matter where you are on the wealth pyramid, no matter where you are on the affordability pyramid, what you don't want is your life to become more affordable or your savings to become less valuable in real terms.
Right.
And gold is absolutely something that can help you at least maintain where you are and stop things getting worse. So talk a little bit for the man in the street who has the fewest options of all. Talk about the options that gold offers them in terms of protecting them to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's kind of everything that we want to come. All rivers lead to this.
Yeah.
Paul Tudor Jones said the other day, all rivers lead to inflation. The end game is inflation. And they're related topics because I do think regardless of whether we have a deflationary cycle, whether it's a mean reversion of the markets or a recession, we're going to fix the problem with more inflation.
Right.
We're going to have to, reflate something. And for the man on the street and gold, it shouldn't have to be such a debate anymore. It shouldn't have to be such an argument to explain the simple reality of how gold as a store of value is infinitely superior than a piece of paper money, whatever the currency, including the world reserve currency, the US dollar. And again, the most obvious example is the famous chart that Ronnie and you and Rolf looked at and he's helped make is the purchasing power of the major world currencies, including the US dollar, since went up the gold standard in 1971 versus a milligram of gold. It's not a gold bug argument to say that dollar that you measure your portfolio with, or your checking account with, or your savings account with, or your return on NVIDIA with, is measured in a currency that's slowly but surely each day, year, and quarter losing bite, losing flavor, losing power. So the man in the street can't solve all the problems in the world that's coming from too much debt, whether that means we have more centralization, whether we have more military conflicts or more failed promises from politicians, more polarized society, a more splintered identity politic, blame game. All those things sadly are here for a while. Gold doesn't fix all that. And gold doesn't fix the largesse of your government's overspending. But what gold does is fix your own personal situation. It protects you in a way where you can be your own central bank, but a better central bank. And again, I hate to say it because I've spent most of my time making fun of things like the Fed or the ECB or certainly the BIS, this supranational beast with unlimited supranational powers and immunity from all sins. But look at what they're doing. Look at what central banks are doing. Whether you like them or not, they're a pretty tough army. They're pretty smart, they're pretty well loaded, and they have a lot of power. And whether you like it or not, there's a reason they're stacking gold. Again, there's a reason the BIS has admitted that it's a tier 1 asset. And there's a reason they're having conversations with the BRICS nations and the West, trying to play both sides of the puck. But the hockey puck, as Gretzky says, is what you got to play. Look at the direction of the puck. what they're trying to say without making headlines is your dollar, your euro, your yen, your peso is even more comical today than it was yesterday.
Yeah.
And we're at the BIS are seeing this, the central bank stacking that we're not reporting, and what the Chinese and the Saudis that are not trying to do this out loud are doing, because the Gulf GCC is taking a lot of gold right here from Switzerland back to their zip codes. What they're all saying without saying it, because watch what they're doing, not just what they're saying, is gold is a better store of value. It's a better strategic and tactical way to save money, to save your wealth. You can spend in fiat when necessary, but the smart money is now storing in gold and spending in fiat, which again, that means the US dollar, the king of FX liquidity and SWIFT, and still a key part of the derivative in the Eurodollar markets, all the things that Brent Johnson rightfully addresses. All these things don't mean the end of the dollar. It just means a weaker repriced dollar, a different dollar. We can't ignore anymore this once kind of esoteric fringe argument that de-dollarization is coming. It was fringe when you said it was meaning the death of the dollar.
Yeah.
It was never going to die. It's just being repriced. And it's like a Maginot Line that the BRICS are not trying to break through. They're just going around. They're going around the dollar. They'll still use it. Saudi Arabia and UAE, their currency's pegged to the dollar. They don't want to see the dollar die. China doesn't want to see the dollar die. But what these countries are tired of is being the dog wagged by the tail of the US dollar and the US Treasury. They're tired of it. It's been over 50 years of exporting inflation and dictating policy. I mean, going on the petrodollar was brilliant. It was a brilliant move that Kissinger et al. Made in the 70s.
Absolutely.
It helped us win the Cold War against Russia because we crushed the ruble. 18 years later, there was immense power in that petrodollar. And that's a long other kind of stovepipe conversation. But that petrodollar isn't ending, but it's changing. That immense power is being rethought right now in real time. And again, not the end of the dollar, but a very, very significant move. Just like it took 50 years for the US dollar to lose 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. Since 2022, the slow move away from this US world reserve currency is irrevocable now. The genie's out of the bottle. Doesn't mean the death of the dollar. I do think it means a repricing of the dollar. It goes back to the man on the street can see this. He can protect him or herself by becoming his or her own central bank, by having a percentage allocation to a physical asset outside of the banking system, which is simply, it's such a cliche, currency insurance for dying currency.
Yeah.
And, again, it shouldn't have to be, that really shouldn't be a gold bug argument. That shouldn't even be a debate about gold versus crypto or gold versus the dollar or the dollar dying or the ruble being the next world reserve currency, all this nonsense. No, it's just a better store of value than fiat money, and certainly better than the US dollar. And the evidence of that is overwhelming. And yet it's so misunderstood. Wrongfully so, you could say deliberately so, by the, RIA industrial complex and the commercial banks and the Fed, which is terrified of a rising gold price. I mean, the fact that gold has outperformed so much this entire century, the first quarter, and yet it's not even discussed in the portfolios, makes you wonder if it's outperforming the S&P, but no one allocates to it because, according to the RIA complex, it's too volatile. Well, that's crazy when you compare it to other asset classes. And again, it doesn't mean gold only goes up and to the right. It doesn't mean gold is a functionality of return on investment. It just holds its value better than everything else you own.
Yeah.
And again, I wish that was more understood. I think it is becoming more understood. Certainly the BRICS and the central banks of the East are figuring that out. The BIS is figuring that out. The West is resisting common sense and truth in a way that is almost staggering right now.
Well, you talked about the BRICS there, and I said I wanted to get back to that before we finish. So let's talk about the BRICS, because this idea that the path forward for the dollar is different now. It was unquestioned for a long, long time. And we're in this situation where the BRICS are clearly both incentivized and motivated to find a way to not kill the dollar and not completely disassociate themselves with using the dollar, but put in an alternative payment system that allows them the freedom to not use the dollar as and where they don't need to.
Right.
And that's, I think, the most important thing, because like everything else in our world, it's absolutes. It's either the end of the dollar or the BRICS thing doesn't stand a chance.
Right.
But we've just had the BRICS summit in Kazan a couple of weeks ago, and nothing concrete was announced. And to a lot of people that went, see, the BRICS is nothing.
Right.
But it's impossible to deny two things. One, to your point earlier on, as you talked about all the countries that are members of the BRICS, and it's growing, is that this bloc is both coalescing and growing. That's inarguable. And it's also inarguable that is in their best interests to find a way around the dollar. And we've had that proven to them over and over again in the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 2 years. So how do you look at the BRICS? How do you evaluate the timeline for the BRICS? And how do you handicap what they're trying to do and what success looks like to the BRICS countries?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything you're saying. There are indicators coming out of whether it was in South Africa last year or Russia this year. There are certain things that aren't finalized and decisive that people are dismissing that as nothing's happening to some things really is happening, and we need to look at that. I joked, if you take your girlfriend to dinner, she spends the whole time staring at the waiter, nothing's really happening, but it's an awkward drive home. Now the wheels are spinning, something's moving here. And what I'm saying is with the BRICS, to your point, it's not the end of the dollar, it's not an all or nothing black and white scenario. Last year, the big buzz was they're going to have a BRICS-based, gold-backed currency out of South Africa, which I thought was a little extreme. This year was Enbridge and this unit of account with Glassiev and the head of the BRICS New Development Bank talking about this 40% gold-backed, 60% local currency-backed unit, which would be, your gold would be in your own zip code and you'd be audited. It wouldn't have to be redeemable out of Moscow or Shanghai, but you could use this unit, which was clearly gold-backed, to be a cross-border settlement, decentralized cross-border. What was interesting about that, it wasn't ratified into law right out of Russia last month, but what's interesting is that they were already looking at the waiter. They were already staring at the handsome waiter. And more importantly, they were staring at a very handsome waiter who has Saudi Arabia on his left arm and the UAE on his right arm. So in other words, the BRICS are now flirting towards foreplay, towards maybe actual marriage, with an idea where oil is going to be bought in a BRICS unit at some point. The flirting has started, and then comes, the hot and heavy. Doesn't matter to me whether it's this year, or next year, or last year, or 3 years. The genie's out of the bottle now. This was unheard of 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
That you'd even be considering. Now, whether the BRICS were able to legislate that into law or get that sanctioned by the BIS, which flipped, the fact that they're already interested in it tells you what's on their mind. The fact that Saudi Arabia is already making some deals outside of the US dollar. That 20% of oil was sold outside of the US dollar last year. Again, these are huge implications. Nobody's talking about. Huge for the dollar, and that there's less demand for that dollar. I think we cannot underestimate when you're talking about the BRICS and all the nations doing, outside the US dollar and what's happening in these conferences. But let's just get to oil without getting into 20 minutes on oil. Oil is power. Energy is power. We can talk about Greta Thunberg all day long, but I'm sorry, we're not going green in the next 10 years. Energy's here for a while. And I think China needs a non-dollar oil solution in a major way for a number of reasons. And Saudi Arabia is all too willing to help. And that is big. And the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are, quote unquote, looking at the waiter, not the American waiter anymore, but a different waiter, flirting, makes that marriage a little dangerous. And it says that we're willing to do what we've already seen done with Russia exporting to China and settling in gold and yuan. Saudi Arabia is willing to settle or net settle oil and gold as well. And whether that's this month or next month is irrelevant. They're already in the works of that. And we're already seeing sales outside of the petrodollar. That petrodollar was a big part of the sucking straw sound of the milkshake theory, which I respect. But that milkshake theory came out in 2019. And the reason I love Brent Johnson is I love that theory because it didn't even make sense to me as Brent Johnson. I saw what they were doing to the dollar. It was so corrupted, so overprinted, so overproduced, and yet it was still strong. And he was right. He knew he was right because he didn't like the outcome. But that was in 2019. You've got to fast forward to the events of history now. And what's happening with this slow but now all at once move, slowly but steady, not just outside of net trade settlements with BRICS partners, but also outside the petrodollar. These are huge. We still have SWIFT, we still have FX, we still have what's left of the petrodollar, and we still have the derivative markets. It's still a great straw-sucking sound. And we still have the world reserve currency, and it's still essential for liquidity. It's the king of liquidity. But with the tier one statement out of the BIS and what's happening now with Enbridge Light, which could be Enbridge Real, that's not gold bugging anymore. That's history, that's armies, that's flags, that's banners and tanks and cavalry and movement that you have to take seriously. And that is one big hockey puck military movement away from the US dollar. And so that means that world reserve currency is getting weaker. And that means, again, gold is going to make moves because central banks are buying gold as a strategic asset, not as a play toy. And that explains the amazing rise in the gold price this year. But again, I'll make it simple, stupid. It's not, gold is not going up because gold is suddenly more in a bull market. It's because the dollar in particular and fiat in general is in a bear market. And it comes from all these things that have made it less trustworthy, certainly weaponizing the US dollar and then going into debt and issuing an IOU that is a declining asset from a less and less credible issuer has consequences at some point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other important thing for people to understand is that, you know, every one of these agreements that gets struck in currencies other than the dollar takes away the power the US has to dictate terms to people.
Right.
Right. Because once those end arounds are in place, you lose the ability to say, we're going to cut you off from the SWIFT system.
Right.
We're not going to, you know, we're not going to. So your stick to beat people with if they don't fall in line becomes a lot less frightening to people. And that, you know, they're the kind of things that change world orders when people suddenly aren't afraid of the bully in the neighborhood anymore. Yeah. And, you know, if you lose your fear for the US and you start to look at it in any way as in a weakened position, if you think to yourself, it doesn't quite have the clout it had when the SWIFT system was everything, well, you know what? Then you start looking at the debt situation. And then you start looking at the deficit system. And suddenly you realize, you know, this guy with a big stick who was smashing us over the head the whole time, it's not just that someone's taken his stick away, but when we look at him, he's actually, maybe it's just a padded coat he's wearing. He's not quite the guy that we thought. And yeah, that's important for people to understand.
Well, it's really interesting. We can close on another military analogy. Because you think about it, that's absolutely true. Big powers don't die easily. Big economies don't die easily. Big currencies don't die easily. They're not admitted to or confessed easily. And I think, again, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had won a lot of battles up until Gettysburg. Most of the northern armies, the Northern Army, the Army of Potomac, et cetera, the generals had a tremendous respect, almost fear, of Jeb Stuart's cavalry and Robert E. Lee's infantry. They were impressive. They had more dash.
Yeah.
But after Gettysburg, hey, we can beat these guys. But yet it took 2 more years to end that bloody war. They didn't give up easily. Whatever you think of Germany during World War II, the Wehrmacht was feared from all over Northern Europe, North Africa to the Eastern Front. But after Stalingrad, they were decisively defeated, and the Russians realized, hey, we can beat these guys.
Yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger, if it bleeds, we can kill it.
Exactly, right? And yet it still took 2 more years. Yeah. And so you go on, Napoleon came out, you know, it took a long time between Moscow and Waterloo, et cetera. But I'm saying, once you realize that the U.S. is not what it was in the iconic Flag over Iwo Jima, in the Bretton Woods moment, in all the Clark Gable movies, and all the Ronald Reagan moments, and all the great Hollywood kind of nostalgia of what America was, whether it was pop culture to our markets and our currency. We're not the same America anymore. We're not as strong. We're clearly not as respected, clearly. And that's why we're seeing this momentum to the east and in these conferences. And even Saudi Arabia's fist pump is an example of that.
Yeah.
So now, is it irrevocable? Maybe Trump can, I don't know. We'll have to see. Again, I think a lot of this is semi-irrevocable. But I don't think weaponizing the dollar in the Ukraine, whatever you think of that war, and that's irrelevant what I think of that war, right or wrong, it was a mistake to weaponize the world reserve currency financially. And I think it ultimately lost more trust for us than it gained. And so there's a lot of mistakes that were made that can maybe be unmade. But short of that, even the U.S. will not go down easily, certainly not under Trump. No one's going to admit defeat or admit that, you know, we should have quit after Gettysburg and signed the peace after Stalingrad. Yeah. But I hope it doesn't mean that we go into more distraction, more name-calling, or God forbid, more war to take the people's mind off the slow decline, not the end, but the changing nature of U.S. hegemony. That's not anti-American to say that. I've got colleagues from the UK. It was once the sun never set on the UK, but yet even the UK and its currency had to admit defeat after war after war after war, debt after debt after debt. We've seen this throughout history. America is simply reaping the rewards of extending its military and its budget beyond its ability to pay.
Well, look, time will tell, and you know, we have now in the White House an accelerant, I suspect, that will at least mean that we get to figure out the end of this movie sooner rather than later. And frankly, with the way things are, the sooner we get through this phase and back to the building phase again, the better. So, look, Matt, it's always a pleasure. Thanks, man. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
My pleasure as well. Absolutely.